Thank you. My name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic. Good evening to good evening to everyone in Wales. God kväll till alla våra vänner i Sverige. Just a little hello to the people in Sweden there. Und einen schönen guten Abend zu unserem Freund aus Deutschland. So on with the business. My date of sobriety is the 24th of July, 1993. My home group is the Hoxton Big Book Study in London on a Friday evening. I have a Texan sponsor I have nothing in common with. What else is true? To talk about the traditions coherently, I need to give a little bit of context about my own recovery and where the traditions sit within that, because they're not these loose principles, they're tied into a whole system. I tried to stop drinking for 3 years before my last drink in 1993. And what was true for me, it wasn't until I was willing to disbelieve my own thinking and simply quietly follow the instructions of someone else because they were doing better than me that my relapsing stopped. For me to relapse, two things have got to happen. I've got to have the idea of a drink, and then I've got to follow the idea because it's my idea. On a good day, I don't get a vote in my own life anymore. The point about saying to my higher power the first thing in the morning, please direct my thinking, is because if my thinking is not directed by a power greater than myself, it will revert to my own little director inside of my ego. The point of the 12 steps for me was to reconnect me with the rest of humanity and thereby reconnect me with my higher power and thereby reconnect me with who I was, which is simply another person on the planet, but with a particular role, but just another ordinary person on the planet. The purpose of the traditions is, I think, twofold. Firstly, to enable the group that I belong to run effectively and efficiently. But secondly, as a set of principles which govern how I interact with other people in the world generally. And then the concepts, just so we have a presentation of all three, the steps, the traditions, and the concepts. If I want to achieve something with other people, in collaboration with other people, I need a set of principles to govern who does what, how do we decide who does what is delegated to who reports to who, when do you ask questions, when do you consult, when do you get on with it, who's the best person for the job, how do you make a decision? If the concepts aren't used, you have anarchy. The traditions lie between the two. They're vital for the group, but as I say, a lot of I benefited hugely from Al-Anon over the last 27 years. If I wasn't a candidate for Al-Anon when I got here, sponsoring several hundred alcoholics in AA will make you a candidate for Al-Anon. Just so you know what might be coming up in your own future. And the Al-Anon problem is to do with boundaries. It's to do with where I stop and the next person begins. And although Al-Anon has helped, it's really the traditions that I apply on a daily basis in all of my relationships which govern where I stop and where you begin and where we get together to engage in activities in the world. But first of all, to understand how to apply the traditions in a more general sense, one's got to understand how they apply in a specific AA group. So I'm going to talk specifically about tradition 4, but again, each individual tradition is part of a network of traditions. To understand tradition 4, we need to understand the whole thing. my view of home groups is it starts, funnily enough, with tradition 5, the primary purpose. I was a member of a group many, many years ago, which was lovely people in their own way. I'm sure I was a lovely person in my own way. But we were not getting on. Certain people would share, and half the room would leave for a cigarette at the point that that person chose to share. Same deal every week. Um, we decided to have a group conscience, and in the group conscience, we asked the question, what is the primary purpose of this group? And about 15 people said it's to discuss the application of the principles contained in the first 164 pages of the book Alcoholics Anonymous to recover from alcoholism and to live effective, constructive lives. The other 15 people said, I just want a safe place to share. That was their primary purpose. Now, no one was right. No one was wrong. But we could not have unity in tradition 1 unless we had a common primary purpose in tradition 5. So it's vitally important when starting a group, in my experience, and I've started a number of groups over the years, is vitally important to agree precisely what is the primary purpose. Because one can't even begin to decide what is the content of the meeting going to be unless you know what you want to achieve, because you can't decide. How do you decide? You can't decide whether the group is operating effectively unless you have an agreed primary purpose. We, at my home group, when we started to go on to Zoom, the first week the membership or the attendance doubled for various reasons. Normally we'd get 50 or 60 people, sometimes more. This time we had 110. And the sharing was all over the place. There's lots of people that were not group members that had never been before were sharing on all sorts of topics. The topics were not bad. So this is not a judgment of what other people are sharing, but it's if there is an agreed primary purpose, and the primary purpose of our group is to discuss how we apply the 12 steps as set out in the big book in our lives. If we've got that, we've got a legitimate reason to say, this meeting is not achieving this anymore. How are we going to change the format to ensure that the group achieves its primary purpose? And we shifted and we've prioritized group members for the sharing. And so the group members are bringing the sharing back on the topic. We're achieving our primary purpose now. I know some groups do lots of, organize lots of social things. Now, the home groups I go to, have gone to over the last few years, there is a social function. So we go for dinner afterwards, or we go for usually dinner. Some groups I belong to, there isn't time, we go for coffee. But we don't bring the organization of that into the group business. The only thing we're interested in the group business is how we're running the group and what goes on inside it. The social stuff can be dealt with informally outside. We want to stick to doing one thing well and one thing properly. In order, however, for a group to achieve its primary purpose, and if the primary purpose is to convey a message of how we recover from alcoholism using the suggestions of the big book, if we're going to do that, I think we have to successfully, we have to mirror what it does in the big book itself, which is to say each person from their own point of view explains how they recovered from alcoholism. And I've been to some wonderful groups around the country and around the world where people, if you were playing big book bingo, you would score house within the first 10 minutes. So all of the quotations are right, all of the passages are right, everyone is saying all the right things, but you could mix up the people and the shares would be the same. And you don't get a sense of who is the human being behind these principles. I have no sense of who these people are. And tradition 3, this notion of anyone can belong to AA if they meet the basic requirement of being an alcoholic, and that's the long form, and then wanting to stop drinking, that's the short form. That's only the beginning of it. What it talks about also in the traditions is that there be no insistence of conformity in any way at all. About 25, 26 years ago, I belonged to a group where there was a dress code. That's a form of conformity. I've been to meetings where everyone is from the same social group. And if you're not from that social group, you're going to feel really excluded. I've changed home groups in the last 6 months, and my older home group, which used to get up to 100 people, one of the reasons I loved it was because you look around the room and there are Christians and Muslims and Hindus and ultra-Orthodox Jews and atheists and transsexuals and gays and lesbians and people who are undefinable in any way, old people, young people, everything. And I loved that because anyone could belong to that group and be made to feel welcome. So tradition 3, to practice tradition 3 in a group, is to make every effort to make sure that everyone can feel welcome to be there, but then to express how they've recovered using the big book from their own point of view, with their own voice, using their own story. And so when I'm sharing at my home group, obviously I make every effort to make sure that what I'm sharing is kosher AA, but I disclose a lot. I tell a lot of different bits of my story. If I've had, at 27 years, a bad week, I'll say I've had a bad week and how I've been applying the program to deal with it. I don't want to be a cardboard cutout. For my group to achieve the primary purpose, it's got to be people reaching from one heart to another heart. And as the big book says, that only happens when people disclose the truth of what is going on in their lives. And so that's where tradition 3 and tradition 5 work together. And the way those two fit into tradition 1 is the way that I've seen, and that group was a very unified group. My current home group is a very unified group. And the way that unity works is that we don't require uniformity. So we don't all have to be the same. We don't have to express things the same way. If someone shares something which is off topic, there isn't a buzzer. I've been at groups where there's a buzzer. If you share off topic, little slap on the wrist, you're brought back. Now, groups are allowed to do that. That's absolutely fine. We'll come to that in tradition 4. But in a good, strong home group, the leadership, and this is what it talks about in Bill W.'s essays on the concepts, is that leadership isn't driving by mandate, it's leading by example. And what I've observed again and again and again is if there's loads of really strong, focused sharing, which arises out of the reading of the day and then is filtered through the recent lived, real, full-blooded experience of the members, people who come into the group naturally start to copy that. People that don't want to be part of that will just go somewhere else after a while. And so I've never, although it's been rocky by not policing things, it works. It works because leadership by example, and people will only copy us if they want what we have. So if we're cheerful, because we're actually cheerful, not because we say we're cheerful. You've got to be literally cheerful for it to be attractive. And we don't require uniformity, we don't require conformity, which means we can all sit there together, even if we disagree hugely. Even if our approaches are different in all sorts of fundamental ways. I've gone through lots of different phases in recovery. My friend Anthony brilliantly says, whatever you judge in AA, you're going to do. So be careful what you judge, because in 10 years' time, you're going to change your tune. You're going to be doing exactly the thing you judged, and you will see why people were doing it in the first place. And so the other part of non-conformity, which enables unity, is people are allowed to make mistakes, people are allowed to grow, people are allowed to change their point of view, to change their approach. And this also brings in this point of disagreement, how we maintain unity within a group. It's also partly concept 12. So my old home group had some very thorny issues over the last couple of years, which went straight to the core of the functioning of the group. And as soon as it became apparent that the group was divided down the middle in terms of a decision that was going to be made. I think it was about who gets to share at the meeting, who gets to share at the workshop, who gets to turn up at the workshop, who gets to turn up at the meeting. They're pretty major questions. We would not force through decisions on a majority of, 31 to 29. That's not how it works. What it talks about in concept 12 is discussion, vote, and substantial unanimity. Until substantial unanimity, that's basically everyone in the room agrees, except maybe there are a couple of people who are sitting in the corner who are happy to disagree. But basically, until you've got a common view, the discussion isn't finished yet. And so we went to huge lengths to make sure that everybody's voice was heard. So we encourage people on these various topics to write a little blurb on what their views were, what they thought about this and why. We collated those into a document anonymized. So this is the practice of Tradition 12. Principles before personalities. What matters is what you're saying, not who you are. It doesn't matter if you're sober 8 weeks or 20 years. If the view is valid, the view is valid. And we collated those views into a document and circulated them, and we postponed and postponed and postponed until we got to a point that it was clear there was a consensus forming around a particular view, and then we were good to go. But it's very rare in my experience that a decision needs to be made now. Most decisions on format, on content, if it can be pushed down the road, if it can be kicked down the road to allow enough time for people to consider and contemplate and discuss, do it, because unity is such a precious thing. This doesn't mean that we're a load of patsies, however. If someone is disruptive, if someone is aggressive, if someone is violent, or if someone is predatory, we pounce. Because that's not, it's not cute and it's not on. So anyone can be a member of AA, but can you come into this room? If you're going to behave yourself, yes. If you're going to disrupt the meeting, no. And the deal that we've had agreed, it's very rare at the two home groups I belonged to in the last 10 years for there to be any degree of substantial disruption. But when it happens, a few people have volunteered to take the person who is disruptive and say, let's go and have our own little meeting in the garden outside the meeting, and let's talk about recovery. Let's talk about alcoholism. Because of your behavior, you can't go in there, but we'll come out here with you. And I think it's page 263 of Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. There's loads of stuff also in the, I'm guessing it's the structure manual. There's a pamphlet on personal conduct in AA. But my experience is deal with it swiftly, deal with it politely. Usually it's the men who get to deal with it because they can be more naturally aggressive. Who knows why? There was a gay and lesbian meeting that I used to go to about 15 years ago where all the gay men would shriek if there was a problem, and it was the lesbians that dealt with the aggressive newcomers. So, different groups do different things work in different places. But to find people who are going to be confident and calm and deal with it so that the meeting can continue, that the group can continue. There is nothing worse than when aggressive or predatory behavior is not dealt with. People will hemorrhage out of that group quicker than anything, particularly women, particularly younger people, people who've got violence in their background. I've sponsored several hundred people over the years, and I know that the vast majority of people that I've sponsored have either had physical violence or emotional abuse or sexual abuse or all of those in their childhood. And it's not cool for those people to be re-traumatized by bad behavior in AA. And that's how groups I belong to have stayed strong. So, but we are also cognizant of the welfare of the individual who at the moment is displaying disruptive or predatory behavior. Page 28 of the big book is really clear that all of us are children of a living God, a living creator with whom we may form a relationship on simple and understandable terms. So this is still a human being. This is still an addict or an alcoholic. And we need to find a way of keeping the channels of communication open with that person to help them get well if they want to get well. So people can be excluded from my home group, but we're not excluding the person, we're excluding the behavior, and we try and look after the person and try and help them find a way to get some help. What else can we talk about? Tradition 4. So this is the long form of tradition 4. With respect to its own affairs, each AA group should be responsible to no other authority than its own conscience. And the word conscience is used a lot in AA. One of the points about the steps, and this is a slight digression, but I think it's relevant to tradition 4. Although I did wretched things when I was drinking and have done many wretched things sober, all of those behavior patterns came from beliefs and thinking patterns that I learnt as a child from society and from the people around me. That was the programming. And it was the programming that was the problem. I wasn't the problem, the programming was the problem. That's how I learned to forgive myself and to forgive others. When I'm behaving badly, it's not because I'm sick or bad or any of those things. It's because the programming is wrong. If other people are behaving badly, the programming is wrong. And I just relied on my whole life until I completed the steps was a series of historical reenactments of scenes from my childhood. Just, the same dynamic, the same pattern, just repeated again and again and again. And the people that, when I was a teenager were shouting at me to humiliate me and to shame me, I as an adult took that behavior pattern, flipped it, and inflicted it on other people. What the steps do is they open a channel within me to listen to a different voice. A friend of mine asks the question, how do you know? How do you know you're listening to God? Well, first of all, I'm told by a Jesuit priest friend of mine, God never shouts. It might be firm, but God never shouts. The still small voice. I've got to get past the surface chatter of fear and guilt and perception of wrongness and attack thoughts. I've got to dive deep down to where there is no surface water disturbance, to the deep. And that's where I get in touch with the higher power. That's where thoughts quietly occur to me. And on page 86 of the big book, it talks about three stages by which God's will gets revealed to me. The first stage of the revelation of God's will is inspiration. The second one is intuitive thought, and the third one is decision. And those are my 3 planes. The spirit comes first. the idea comes in. Then the intellect comes in. I start to play with the idea, think through the ramifications, ask myself how it would work in practice. And then the third stage, it comes all the way down to earth and turns into a decision-making action. So where it talks about conscience in the concepts, where it talks about conscience in tradition 2 and tradition 4, where it talks about developing a relationship with a higher power in step 11, what it's talking about in each case, in my experience, is that journey from getting still enough to access this universal consciousness and bringing it all the way down through in my own life in the steps to the practical actions. What tasks am I going to perform today on behalf of my higher power? Because I'm the agent, I'm not the principal. I have no skin in the game. My job is just to do God's will. But it doesn't start with the actions. It starts with the inspiration. If you're in a job, you have to go and talk to your line manager and find out, what does your line manager want you to do today? And I do that in step 11. It's exactly the same in the concepts as well, that you have this universal consciousness in the worldwide fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, which expresses itself in the conscience of the individual group, which then gets delegated to the GSRs. It goes down through the structure to the conscience of AA's conference in Great Britain. And at each level, it's coming from this universal consciousness, badunk, 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 until you have one of the General Service Board's committees actually taking an action and publishing a pamphlet or a poster. So the reason I wanted to say that is because it's relevant to tradition 4, it's relevant to tradition 2. I've been in group consciences and business meetings in AA at group level, at intergroup level, at region level, where it ain't conscience that is being expressed. Something is being expressed, but conscience, it ain't. Power-driven argument, rants, little emotional outbursts, tears, storming out, storming back, answering back, needling little jabs in the ribs. I mean, all sorts of rotten behavior. We've all done it, I'm sure. If you haven't, just wait. You think you're totally calm. You make it through the meeting thinking this group conscience is going to be great. I'm totally chilled. I'm totally in touch with my higher power. The group conscience is 30 minutes long. First 27 minutes, you're good as gold. And then you know who starts sharing, and immediately you feel the rage rise up within you, and it kind of squeaks out. You have the grace not to rant, but people know that you're heated in the situation. In my experience, if I'm not at peace, I'm not in touch with my conscience. There's one exception to the foregoing. Sometimes saying the right thing is going to ruffle feathers and, if you'll pardon my French, piss a few people off. And if you've got the tiniest little bit of codependence hardly worth mentioning, you might be a little tense, anticipating saying something that the rest of the group does not want to hear. That's a different type of tension. That's the tension that's where there's just a bit of interference in anticipating the communication of the idea. But what is my primary purpose in wanting to communicate this? Is this coming from my conscience, believing that this is in the best interests of the group? Or is this coming from a personal preference, a personal vendetta, wanting things to be done my way just so they're done my way? Where is this really coming from? And in order to make sure in a group conscience setting that what I'm saying is coming from my own conscience, I ask myself, there are a couple of little sets of questions which I find are useful. The first one is, does it need to be said? Second one, does it need to be said right now? Third one, does it need to be said by me? So I think of 1,000 things to say in region meetings. I try and limit myself to half a dozen. And I try and remain calm when I'm saying it. I still have trouble saying, I don't have trouble saying things that need to be said. I have trouble being okay with other people hating it. That's the thing I still struggle with. But I try and limit myself to what absolutely has to be said. And I've noticed the region, I'm a conference delegate at the moment. Not that there's a conference until October this year, but I'm a conference delegate. And so I get to go to the region meetings. And I have to say, in large part, I think that notion of people speaking only in accordance with their conscience and not allowing power-driven argument to drive their contributions is pretty universally observed, and that the region functions very well. And so I think tradition 4 links very closely to tradition 2 there, because it's all about conscience, as opposed to doing things a certain way simply because other groups do things a certain way, doing things a certain way because the literature tells us we have to do things a certain way. Conscience trumps the literature. Conscience trumps what my home group is, where my sponsor is. My home groups have been pretty good at always asking ourselves, are we doing what is right in terms of carrying the message, or are we just treading water? Are we just trotting out the same thing again and again and again because that's what we've always done? Next line in the long form, but when its plans concern the welfare of neighbouring groups also, those groups ought to be consulted. There are two situations where I see that arising in practice. The first one is a conference question this year about whether if people want to start a group, should they consult all the neighbouring groups to see if it's okay, in inverted commas, to start the group. I know there are some parts of the country, I know in Bournemouth and Poole they do that. I think it's relatively unusual. And that's something that doesn't happen in London. So I'm not going to talk about that idea, but it is something that does circulate. But the other time it is relevant, my home groups have always done public information work. So we try and carry the message to the local community. We draw a little map with a radius of half a mile around the group, or a mile around the group. It's London, so it's very, very dense. And we go to organisations there, churches, mosques, schools, police stations, community centres, all of the usual things on the list of people to go and talk to for public information. And it's terribly important that if one does that one notifies neighbouring groups, so that if they're also doing public information, you get a cut-off line for where you stop and the other group starts. And it's also important to get the cutoff with intergroup. So intergroup handles certain things, but the intergroup public information officer cannot communicate, in a London borough with all of the agencies representing 500,000 people. They can't do it. Lots of it has to be done at group level. So that's the specific situation where there is sensitivity to other groups. When starting a group also, it's something that one always considers the welfare of the fellowship as a whole. In other words, I'm looking, when I start a new group, where is the gap? Where is the time and place where there isn't a meeting? I would never ever start a group at the same time as another group 300 yards away. Show them the courtesy of finishing half an hour before they start, or starting half an hour after they end. and looking to fill the gap in terms of content. So if there isn't a big book meeting, that's where I want to start a big book meeting. I don't want to be starting competing big book meetings. Looking at the next line, and no group, regional committee, or individual should ever take action that might greatly affect AA as a whole without conferring with the trustees of the General Service Board. One of the difficulties with talking about the traditions in the 21st century, like decades and decades after they were formulated, is the instances of breaches are so rare, particularly with tradition 4. It's very difficult to find examples. I've struggled to think of examples of where that line has been breached. The one example I can think of where I've seen legitimate disquiet about what a group does is where the group has secondary purposes. So sometimes there are groups which put on the literature table literature which is non-conference approved, but they don't mark it as non-conference approved literature. They don't have it on a separate table. There have been groups, I'm not going to name names, there have been groups which put out religious material, which make pretty strong statements about certain groups in society. The danger there is when the newcomer walks into the room, they don't know that that's just, the crazy group that has a terrible reputation in the area. They think that is AA as a whole. And so I very rarely see situations where the intergroup has a legitimate interest in interfering in a group's activities. But that is the one. It's where there's some kind of illegitimate restrictive membership or other ideas being peddled as part of the group. There's a further spiritual principle, though, with tradition 4, which I'd like to talk about in my own life. Being someone that was a candidate for Al-Anon, what made me a candidate for Al-Anon was entanglement with other people, emotional entanglement. Not being responsible for myself, but feeling responsible for other people, not letting other people be responsible for themselves, but making them responsible for me or blaming them for my emotional state, my life, my experiences, my circumstances. The great point for me of applying tradition 4 in my life is, so this is true in my relationship. I'm married to someone, have been married. We've been together for coming up for 16 years. I have my own life. He has his own life. We have a common ground, and it talks in the chapter, The Family, afterward, that each of us meet on the common ground of love and tolerance and mutual understanding. The notion of there being common ground implies that there is private ground as well. So I'm allowed to have my own private domain, my own thoughts, feelings, inner life. He is allowed to have his own thoughts, feelings, attitudes, inner life. And if he wants to share anything from his inner life to me, I'm honored, I'm privileged, it's welcome. But I don't get to ask, I don't get to pry. Other people's private lives are none of my business. My private life is not anyone else's business, except if something affects both of us in a legitimate way, and not simply because I feel possessive. So if I feel possessive and jealous, it will appear to affect me. What other people are doing or not doing will appear to affect me, but it doesn't. It doesn't affect my actual life. It only affects me because I'm making it my business. And what this allows, this notion of a common ground, is that we both have our own emotional space, so that when we're meeting together on the common ground, it's in an act of generosity and extending ourselves. A friend of mine says that one of the most terrifying images is of a couple sitting on a sofa watching television, and one squeezes the other one's hands and shrugs her shoulders and says, "No secrets, eh?" And this notion that everything inside you must be disclosed to your other half, that they get to see your phone, that they get to read your papers, that they get to know where you are and what you're doing at any time. Now, someone might say, well, does that mean you can get away with murder? No, because I have a moral obligation to act in an upstanding way. I have a moral obligation not to have anything that needs to be kept secret. That's the great way of avoiding having to um, tell people things that are secrets on page 86 of the big book, is not to do anything that needs to be kept secret. But nonetheless, it's important for my own integrity to have my own freedom of thought and emotion, and to allow other people their own freedom of thought and emotion. So when my other half, when my mother, when my friends are upset about anything, I get to offer, if I can help in any way, if you want to talk to me, that's fine. I'm very happy. But if you don't, that's fine too. There have been times when people that are close to me are going through some awful things and are not available to me as a person. I don't get to demand anything. That's their life. That's their business. Whatever anyone offers to me is gratefully accepted. But I don't have any demands of other people. And tradition 4, when taken beyond its original setting of the group to being a spiritual principle, hooks closely into tradition 7. So tradition 7 says that I'm fully self-supporting through my own contributions, which means that my reliance is on my inner relationship with the higher power. And that may require me getting help or advice or input from other particular human beings at particular times, but my emotional dependence is not on any other specific person, not even my sponsor. You know, if something happens to my sponsor, I've got a little short list of people who are going to get called. There is no reliance there. If there's no reliance, it doesn't mean that there isn't a huge amount of interdependency practically. Lives get entwined, but they need to be entwined, not enmeshed. I need to be able to extract myself if things change, to extract myself and to talk to different people, to get help from different people at the drop of a hat. If I don't have any reliance on any other individual for anything, I suddenly discover I have no demands left of other people, because no one owes me anything. If there's any obligation in the world, it isn't from the world to me. As Mark Twain said, the world was here first. It does not owe you anything. But since I've been put here, I owe the world something. And sometimes people speak in AA and they say, you know, the recovery is so wonderful. I'm so happy, and in all of these important ways, and I've got this and I've got that, and my life is so big, and I've got a career. And it's still I feel this, I feel that. And that's fine. That's a phase. I've been through that phase. I'll probably go through that phase again. But my current view is that the point of me being on the planet is not to be happy. The point of me being on the planet is to maximize my usefulness to the people on the planet. So my question is not, what are other people doing for me? My question is, what am I doing for other people? How am I making best use of the 24 hours given to me on a 24-hour basis to be a channel for the higher power to work through me in other people's lives in small, practical ways? There's nothing grand about this. There's nothing newsworthy. There's nothing you would put on an epitaph, but my time is well spent. I would rather get to the end of my life saying that I've used my life, I've used the time given to me well, and by the way, I've been pretty happy for a lot of it, than to say I've been blissfully happy, but useful. Who knows if I've been useful? I don't want to have that regret at the end of the day. And that's why the alcoholism had to go. The active alcoholism had to go. It was getting in the way of me becoming who I was supposed to be, which is an empty vessel for the higher power to work through me. So I think I've run out of puff. You've probably run out of puff as well listening to that. But thank you for listening and thank you for inviting me. And I think it's 2 weeks' time, the concepts, but correct me if I'm wrong, Gary. Thank you.